Local programming on KRWG made possible in part by viewers like you. Thank you.
This is KRWG, TV, radio, online, news that matters. Now, across the Mesilla Valley and the borderland, the stories that shape our community. From the KRWG Broadcast Center at New Mexico State University, this is Newsmakers.
Up front this week, the review of the Organ Mountains Desert Peaks National Monument has put our public lands in the spotlight. Later in Focus, we'll talk with a local conservationist. But first, a few reports that highlight our desert surroundings. We begin with a visit to the Prehistoric Trackways National Monument just outside Las Cruces. Christian Valle takes us there as part of our series, Living Here.
The trackways have been here for about 280 million years in the early Permian period of the late Paleozoic. What sort of creatures were making these tracks? If there's one thing I want people to take away from this, is that these were not dinosaurs, is that these were before the dinosaurs. This was a time when the first sort of reptiles were coming out. We have mammal-like reptiles such as Dimetrodon, and he's the famous track maker here. And then we have a whole number of different amphibian-like creatures that were also making tracks, as well as arachnids and various other types of insects. The trackways were known in isolated, very small little bits in the Robledo Mountains for a long time. But it was a man named Jerry McDonald who was a student at NMSU and decided that there was probably more out here and that he was going to find them. And he spent a lot of time out here in the 80s doing that until he found where we are right now, which is the discovery site. And it was here in 1987 that he found the first real big slab, which was probably the trackway of Dimetrodon. When these animals walked along this tidal flat in the mud and the silt, they would of course leave their footprints. Many different types of preservation ensues. So often an animal will step on the sediment and leave their actual print. When sediment then comes and covers it up, it'll fill in that space and you'll get a sort of a cast and mold effect. But also if the animal is large enough, they'll deform layers underneath the surface and we'll get what's called an undertrack, such as this one here of Dimetropus. And so many of the tracks that we see, that you would see here at the discovery site, are of this style. They're an actual 3D version of what the track would have been. How were the trackways preserved? It's almost a perfect storm of just the right amounts of sedimentation to preserve them, not too high energy that they would all be eroded away, but just enough water movement that would, lightly deposit mud and silt on top of them over hundreds of thousands of years that would bury them. In the intervening 280 million years, that just happened to miss this block of limestone. And if you get really close, you can actually see that there's fossils. There's little bits of fossils everywhere in it, but that's the nature of limestone. Currently, there is one guided hike that I lead monthly to the discovery site. It's about 1.5 miles to the site, and then of course 1.5 miles back to the parking area. And it usually takes 3 or 4 hours, depending on how much I stop and talk. Usually the third Saturday of the month. I'll go occasionally, it's the fourth Saturday. And in the summer, it tends to start at 8. Although in the fall, winter, and spring, it tends to be at 9. The difficulty of the trails in the monument, I would rate them as moderate. There's no real easy trail, and they tend to go straight up and down some of these hills, and they're very rocky. So for a pedestrian on foot, it can be a little difficult to get around in here. Prehistoric Trackways National Monument is located just to the northwest of Las Cruces, New Mexico, in the Robledo Mountains, which are just north of Picacho. The monument was established for its paleontological resources. And if people just came in and took what they saw, then there wouldn't be any more fossils for the rest of us. Take only pictures, leave only footprints, which then I then add, especially the trackways. Just leave the trackways where you find it.
Now a reminder that our community is very active in the deserts, some more than others. KRWG has been working with media students at Las Cruces High School, and Ben Curry went above and beyond, literally. In this report, he captured breathtaking drone footage and an insightful interview on the ground with an amazing athlete.
My name's Mikey Sklar. I live in Truth or Consequences. I'm 40 years old and have been running ultras for about 4 years. I had read Born to Run and other popular books, but it was more about, we were on a road trip. My girlfriend had wrote a book called The Good Life Lab, and we were on like a 7-month book tour, just promoting the book all over. And we were just getting huge. I was physically getting really fat just from eating out all the time and going out all the time. And I ran into an old girlfriend just randomly on this road trip, and she's like, you should try doing some runs. You should try doing some long runs. I think you'd really like it. And that was enough to be like, okay. So I started doing 5Ks and 10Ks on my own and building up some miles. And I never ran a half marathon or went to any other races. I just signed up for an ultra race, a 31-mile race in New Mexico, and it took about 6 months, but I had enough training and went and finished the race, and I came in 7th place. So I was pretty excited to take it a little more seriously and start doing ultras more regularly. Initially I had all this extra weight, and the weight was just falling off very quickly with running, and so I got into shape. But then it became more about as a way of running away from things. I had a bunch of unpaid taxes I had to deal with, so running was just a way to be away from nasty IRS letters. I had work projects that I wasn't really focusing on, so I'd use running as a way to be away from that. And eventually I wrote a program to convert books to audio. So I would buy a Kindle book and then rip off the encryption and convert it into a fast talking computer voice talking away at me. So it was a way to read and have that be out doing a 3 or 4 hour run, but also finishing a book at the same time. So I've learned to actually read about 5 books a week, and you can just kind of download the latest books that aren't even in audio form, and that becomes sometimes my goal is not so much about racking up mileage, it's about just finishing more books. I've only had one scenario where I've started hallucinating. The case was I was helping a friend finish a race. It was a 200-mile nonstop race, so it's kind of like a 4 or 5 day event. And it was up in Colorado, so pretty high elevation in the mountains, over 12,000 feet pretty regularly. The whole course kind of dipped between 10,000 to 12,000. So you're pretty high up, and higher than I'm used to living at. So that's a challenge in itself. But by about hour 26 into the race, I was having pretty solid hallucinations. First, they came in audio form, so I would be near water sources like running rivers and little creeks and streams, and they would make enough white noise, a shh, that I would just start hearing conversations and voices within those. Not anything I could discern, like not a real conversation, not scary voices threatening me or anything like that. It's just like background noise, like at a restaurant. You're not really hearing the discussion. And then by about hour 29, we'd be walking through the forests or other things, and there's all these downed trees to the side of the trail, and what I would primarily see was like, I would see like junkyard stuff, like water heaters and upside down cars and a bunch of garbage. Like, that's not what it was. It was like a downed pine tree, but my mind was just creating these elaborate scenarios. So I think they're technically called figments, and the hallucinations are really when you have full-on engagement, when you're actually interacting with someone and can't tell it apart from reality. So that was my hallucination experience.
Welcome to In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno. President Donald Trump's proposed border wall has drawn criticism from wildlife advocates who are speaking out against the proposed wall along the U.S.-Mexico border, saying that it may impact wildlife and the ecosystem of the region. Here to tell us more about that is Michael Dax. He's a national outreach representative with Defenders of Wildlife. Michael, thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me.
And I'd like to start off with what ecosystems may be impacted by this proposed wall?
Yeah, so there are three main ecosystems that we're concerned about. Coastal California, the Sky Islands, which is starting west of Las Cruces and going over into Arizona, the Tucson area, and then the Rio Grande Delta, Gulf of Texas area. I think a lot of us think about the border as being this dusty place, but when we get down into Texas, we're talking about these rich riparian areas that support not only fish, but also birds, reptiles, things like that. But also we have these desert ecosystems as well. In California, you have desert ecosystems that support species like the desert tortoise, and even here in New Mexico, the boot heel, we have Mexican wolves that are crossing the border as well.
Now, obviously, if the wall is placed up, that can cause some issues. But I was curious, some of these species that your group has mentioned are endangered species. What exactly are the endangered species that really could face some issues if this wall is erected?
So two of the ones that we're most concerned about are jaguars and Mexican wolves. So with jaguars, the most of the population is in Mexico, but over the past couple of years, we have seen evidence of 3 jaguars that have crossed the border. So we know that they're crossing the border, and right now they have been males crossing the border. Males tend to have larger ranges than females, but if we're going to get a real population up here, we need females crossing the border as well. So a couple lonely males crossing the border isn't going to do that, so we need to take actions that are going to promote their movement northwards, and obviously a wall would be a huge impediment to that. And Mexican wolves are the same thing. Right now the Fish and Wildlife Service is getting ready to release a new draft recovery plan, and we have a feeling that they're going to push a lot of the recovery down onto Mexico, and especially with Mexican wolves, one of the biggest obstacles to their recovery is their genetic diversity. Right now, the wild population in New Mexico and Arizona is about 113 animals, and they're more or less related as brother and sister to each other because they're so inbred. And so if we do end up pushing recovery onto Mexico, which we think we should bear a much larger burden of that, there's going to need to be genetic migration across the border so that the Mexican population can breed with the United States population and get rid of that genetic bottleneck and have a genetically healthy population. So again, a border wall would seriously impede their ability to migrate.
Now you mentioned, the Mexican gray wolf. If something like that, what kind of wall, how could that really have an impact on that population that they're trying to reestablish?
Well, it depends on the type of wall. I mean, we've seen, right now there's both pedestrian and vehicle wall that are already constructed on parts of the border. If we're talking about a pedestrian wall, that would also block wildlife from crossing. And if they're not able to get across, they might not be able to migrate, they might not be able to breed, and all of a sudden you have these island populations that are functionally not able to operate as most wildlife populations are.
Now, what happens from there? How does that impact the ecosystem in our area if you don't have, those species of animals?
Right. So wolves are ecosystem engineers. They are top predators, and there's been increasing research over the past 20 years about the effect that wolves have on ecosystems, and where a lot of this work has been done is in Yellowstone National Park. That has shown that wolves have the impact of affecting pretty much every other species out there in the landscape. So right now, one of the big problems that we have in New Mexico is that we have these big elk populations that are able to just sit down in the valleys, munch down all the riparian vegetation, and there's really nothing out there threatening them. So that they just sit down there and eat down all the willows, all that vegetation that helps stabilize stream banks. It provides habitat for birds. Trees, of course, would be forage for beavers, which once they're constructing dams, all of a sudden that's better fish habitat, that's better habitat for frogs and other amphibians. And so, you could just trace it to so many different places, and having a healthy population of wolves would mean that those elk are forced to disperse, that woody vegetation can come back. In New Mexico, of course, water conservation is so important, and having more vegetation by the stream banks will help keep the water in those stream banks and time release it back into the stream over the course of the spring and summer, which is good for humans, it's good for wildlife, it's good for all of us.
Now, how do we make that connection between the species of animals, the ecosystem, and then, us in Las Cruces sitting in our air conditioning homes? I mean, how do we make that connection to really how important it is to preserve, this along the border? How's it going to impact us in cities and the communities nearby the border?
Well, ecotourism is a huge part of it. I mean, we've seen this with the Oregon Mountains already, that just in the past couple of years, there's been increased tourism to Las Cruces. Las Cruces is making these top 10 lists of places to visit, places to retire to. In Yellowstone National Park, wolf tourism is responsible for about $35 million in tourism alone each year. Right now, our wolf population hasn't been big enough, and it's dispersed over a large enough area that we haven't necessarily seen that sort of tourism take off, but that's certainly possible in the future, and that's certainly what we'd like to see. And Las Cruces would likely be one of those jumping off points. And so you have that economic factor, in addition to the fact that you have a healthier landscape. Lots of people in the southern part of the state go over to the Gila Wilderness, go over to places like Silver City because they're gorgeous, and I think all of us want to see those landscapes continue to be healthy for generations to come, and having all the wildlife there will help keep those landscapes healthy and productive.
How would the potential proposed wall, are there any health impacts that could really have if it were erected?
Well, when you talk about constructing a border wall in the river, all of a sudden, downstream of here, El Paso, and where the river becomes the border going down, you construct a wall in the river, it certainly seems like it could have health impacts.
I see. Now, what does your organization plan to do to really make an impact to educate communities? I know you're here joining us to talk about this, but is there anything else you have going on?
Yeah, education is huge. Litigation is never something that's off the table. And so right now we're really trying to see what form the border wall is going to take as far as funding mechanisms and what's going to be proposed, because I think there's a lot that's up in the air. So some of it's wait and see, but we're ever vigilant and looking for the appropriate places to step in.
Border security is important to a lot of folks. What are some of the things that you're seeing with proposed walls that could help, keep border secure, but also, keep from hurting the ecosystems that are along the border?
Right. Well, there are all sorts of other security measures that can be taken, and I'm definitely not a homeland security expert or anything like that. But during the legislative session in February, Representative McCamley had a bill to block state land from being used to construct a border wall. And at one of the hearings, he said something like, this is a 14th century solution for a 21st century problem. Walls and moats, dragons are things of the past, and there are technologies that we have access to that could be much more effective and certainly wouldn't cost nearly as much. And we're certainly not advocating for any particular solution, but everyone from both of our senators to Representative Pierce and Representative Lujan Grisham up in Albuquerque are saying this border wall is simply not going to work, and also it's going to have the added consequences of being detrimental to wildlife.
Well, Michael, thank you so much for joining us.
You bet. Thank you so much for having me.
And we want to thank you for joining us for In Focus. I'm Anthony Moreno.
It's sticky and sweet. We use it in cooking and stir it in our tea. Let's discover what all the buzz is about as we explore honey. Honey making is a collaborative effort between nature and human beings, and it's been taking place since ancient times. It involves bee colonies, native plants, agricultural crops, and beekeepers. 1/3 of all food is dependent on bee pollination. There are between 60,000 and 90,000 bees that live in a hive, and they each have specific jobs. There is only one queen per hive, and she's in charge. During the summer, she can lay as many as 3,000 eggs per day. Each hive has around 200 drones, and their only job is to mate with the queen. The rest are female worker bees in charge of gathering nectar, making honey, and taking care of the other bees in the hive. Honeybees need to tap about 2 million flowers to make 1 pound of honey.
My favorite in the Southwest is acacia honey, but it's very difficult to get. And around New Mexico here, generally you can only get it in small amounts, and it has to be from a real specialty beekeeper that puts their hives where the acacias are, and that's whitethorn acacia. But the more prevalent one around here would be mesquite, and mesquite is the next finest. It has just this incredible flavor to it. And there also, we have like a valley blend here in the Mesilla Valley, and you get wonderful flavors from like the alfalfa that's grown here, and sometimes with the cotton and other wildflowers mixed in there.
In seed production, bees are very important. Unless a crop is wind pollinated, it must be pollinated by insects, and bees typically do the job. The same is true for fruit crops, where flowers must also be pollinated to produce the fruit. Aside from its use as a natural sweetener in food, honey and the wax created by honeybees can be used to make candles, lotions, balms, sealants, and cosmetics.
We offer children's theater and film for all children of southern New Mexico, and we encourage children from age 3 up through high school to come and join us and come play with us. They learn reading skills and writing skills because they have to write some things out. They have to help us invent their character, so they have to be able to interpret the reading, and then lots of fun. I have to find something where all of the kids are going to have lines. We don't ever have kids in our show that only walk across the stage or they're only standing in the background. They all have lines. I have had a few, but it's when they say, I just don't want to talk, don't make me say anything. But otherwise I think that's part of learning to be an actor and learning to perform.
It takes place in China. It was just a lot of fun because I had 2 parts. I was like an emperor, and then I was like a soldier, and we had swords. And the first time I was really nervous, but then when I was on stage, I felt kind of good about it, and I wasn't nervous anymore.
We have a lot of parents who come and say, I'd love for him to try it, but I don't know if he's going to want to perform because he's so shy. And once he gets started, you know, he realizes, oh, I can do this because I'm not really myself. I'm in a costume. I'm, you know, the bright lights, I can't really see the people anyway. And so it's a great outlet for kids who have those kinds of things too. But I think all kids benefit from being on stage. They want to come back and play with us, so they start doing what we call the Padawan class. They come in and learn set building and set design and lighting design, whatever their interests are.
I joined ACT when I was 4 as an actor. This summer, when they were doing Colors of the Wind and Casey at the Bat, I was helping Padawans, so I was doing sound and helping with like set and helping out with the kids. A children's theater has impacted me a lot because now I have a better understanding of the people around me, just because I do get to meet all these kids who come from different homes and different lifestyles, and so I kind of get that understanding of what it's like to be in different scenarios. And then acting itself has helped me understand movement and what specific movements could mean to a person, and that can show you how they're feeling or what they're thinking, and it's impacted my life a lot. I would love to be on Broadway, but I know it's a hard business, so I'm gonna go into school and get a nurse practitioner degree, but then I'll probably do auditions and stuff in spare time.
Our website is good. The information there is updated really regularly, so they can find information there. achildrenstheater.wix.com/achildrenstheater. That's one place, and Facebook. We don't plan for our kids to be Hollywood stars or to hit Broadway. If they do, that's great. We want them to have those opportunities. But mostly the Children's Theater is here to encourage kids to, you know, explore an outlet that maybe they haven't had a chance to explore before, and to just have fun and do something creative.
That's our time for now. Join us this week on KRWG Radio. Every weekday, it's Morning Edition 5 to 9, Fresh Air at 11, followed by Here and Now, noon to 2, and All Things Considered 4 to 7. KRWG News is always online at krwg.org, and we'd love to hear from you. Email us with your story ideas and video submissions. The address is feedback@nmsu.edu. For all of us at KRWG News, I'm Fred Martino. Have a great week. We'll see you next time on Newsmakers.